magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld I'm Brent, and this is part 3 of the comprehensive 9th edition Aeldari Codex review. In this section, I'll be discussing the new secondary objectives and also psychic powers. If you have not already listened to my first thoughts video, I strongly recommend starting with that. It discusses how Craftworlds have changed overall as a faction. I think there's some things that might be useful to you in that if you're coming to this for the first time. Parts 1 and 2 are obviously also intended to precede Part 3, but maybe you have a reason for starting with Part 3. Maybe you're just here for secondary objectives or psychic powers. You do you. I'm sure you have your reasons. Okay, before we dive into the 4 secondary objectives, I am going to briefly address what I think makes a good secondary objective for competitive 9th edition 40k. So 3 things. 1, reliably high scores. You obviously, with all 3 of these, you want a pretty good chance of racking up the points. To me, that means you want one that you've got a good chance of getting to 15 with, and another one should be getting to about 12, and the third one you want to be coming pretty close to 10, ideally getting above 10. I guess partially this is because it can be hard to max out the primary score for Craftworld Eldar. Even now, I think that you definitely will in some games. Some games you'll go all the way, but the ability to reliably score on your secondaries is pretty important for all factions. It's extra important for Craftworlds. 2, a player needs to be able to achieve that reliably pretty high score without disproportionate resource expenditure. So a great example of this is in the last codex, a couple of units of Swooping Hawks or a unit of Warp Spiders were just gold, not because they had real combat chops, but an MSU Warp Spider unit with Web of Deceit, which is still a thing that exists, could pretty much guarantee you a reasonably good score for Engage on All Fronts and what was Retrieve Octarius data and what's now Retrieve Nachman data. It was obviously in concert with other things. For Engage on All Fronts, for example, you need 4 units to be maxing that one out. But it was the spiders were like the clutch unit that enabled you to do that. And so that was an example of a unit that cost less than 100 points and was worth a ton of secondary points at the end of the game, even though it's not participating in combat. So the ability to score at a relatively high level and to not exclusively devote a bunch of points in CP in order to being able to pull those scores off. Now, keep in mind that if with something like Will of Azurian or Azurian or Azurian, that psychic power that lets a unit shoot and still perform an action definitely opens up our action-based secondaries in an interesting way. Anything performing Engage on All Fronts or a positioning secondary may still be able to participate in the battle. So you don't necessarily need to think of units that you are using to score secondaries as lost points or points that are devoted exclusively to secondaries. But you have to ask yourself, is this unit also going to do other things? And if not, well, that's a consideration. Also, secondaries that force a unit to be in a position where it's, even though it theoretically could participate in the battle, will then just get eliminated. You're trading that unit for points. That can sometimes happen with maxing out Engage on All Fronts, and so you have to take that into consideration too. So we want something that will score reliably and will not be a disproportionate resource sink. And then lastly, we want secondary objectives that cannot easily be fouled up by an opponent. Ideally can't really be fouled up by an opponent at all, except in the most bizarre, unpreventable circumstances. And you might think that the rules writers would have written the secondaries, so there's always something your opponent can do to prevent you from scoring them. And that's not really the case. It's pretty hard to prevent somebody from scoring at least reasonably well at Engage on All Fronts if they have a certain kind of an army. You can prevent them from maxing it for sure. Some of the action-based ones too, specifically people lean into Retrieve Nachman data because it's a little bit tricky to prevent. Now, some factions have in their codexes a third secondary option that doesn't need to take the place of one of those two, that they can score reliably that you cannot prevent as their opponent and that is not super resource expensive, and that's a huge boon. And I do not think that's where we are with this, but we do have some decent options, and I will talk about what's good about them and then what I think the liabilities are relative to the three characteristics that I just identified. Okay, the first one listed in the book is a Warpcraft secondary objective called Scry Futures. So because it's a Warpcraft objective, you would be taking this instead of something like Psychic Interrogation, or we don't take up Horror of the Witch because we always take Psychers, but Pierce the Veil or Warp Ritual. And just to remind you, Psychic Interrogation is one of my Psychers does a psychic action within 24 inches of a character to score points. Pierce the Veil is you do it within 6 inches of your opponent's battlefield edge, and Warp Ritual is you do it within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. Now, all of these have essentially the same. Of those, I think that, kind of for obvious reasons, Psychic Interrogation is usually the best pick for us, best play. There are bizarre circumstances in which if there's an objective in the center of the board and you just want to go all in on winning the game by controlling the central objective because it's incentivized also in the additional primary scoring conditions, maybe there's circumstances in which you would do that. But of those three, if you were going to go this route as a Craftworlds player, the Psychic Interrogation one is solid because you can have some Psyker on a jet bike that just has to be within 24 inches of an enemy character. You don't even need line of sight, and that's just not hard because we're a pretty mobile army. And then succeed on this psychic test and score 3 points every time you do it. That's pretty good. All psychic secondary objectives, though, have the same liability, and it's this. Barring tricks, scoring psychic secondaries relies on your ability to roll equal to or higher than your opponent on 2d6. Now, yes, there can be dice modifiers. And if that's the situation, I'm not on board. I don't like depending on a scoring mechanic that requires me to win a roll off with a slight advantage. It just everyone listening to this plays dice games. We know how easily that can go against you and maybe cost you a game. I think the circumstances under which it makes sense to really consider a Warpcraft option are circumstances in which you can be reasonably sure that your opponent is simply not in a position to beat you out. And the new codex has made psychic secondaries significantly more viable because of fate dice, right? The Strands of Fate. If I have a Strands of Fate die that guarantees me that at least one of my psychic dice will be a 6, well then I have a 100% chance of succeeding on any of these psychic actions, all of which have low warp charge values because I can't do worse than a 7. But I also stand a pretty good chance of outrolling my opponent, especially if I have some sort of bonus to that roll. I think for many of the craft worlds, it's still a little touch and go whether or not you'd want to do this. You can fail, you can fail to get the Strands of Fate dice that you need. But if you're playing Ulthwé, well, Ulthwé have +1. Ulthwé Psychers have +1 the first time they perform a psychic action or cast a power, and so the odds of your opponent beating you, if you can usually make one of your fate dice a 6, if all of you need to do is tie or exceed and you're at +1, is pretty good. And on top of that, in a pinch, you could always use Focus Will. If you're planning to play Warpcraft secondaries, it makes sense to think about including Focus Will, which is a Runes of Fortune power that allows you to give a nearby Psyker +2 to a cast. And Ulthwé also have this ability where if you take the special Ulthwé relic, that is, on a 9+, when they cast, their casts are undeniable. Now, I know a few of you are going ballistic right now because in a previous video, I wrongly suggested that you could use Strands of Fate plus Focus Will to guarantee that you auto-succeeded on some psychic action and your opponent can be. And if you look at the rules for that relic, as was pointed out to me in the comments, yes, you're totally right. It has to be an unmodified roll. So you do, if you just think about the math on that, if you're using a Strands of Fate die and you know that one of your rolls is definitely going to be a 6, so then all I need is a 3-up on the other one in order to guarantee that I get an undeniable power, that means if you're using Strands of Fate for an Ulthway caster 2/3 of the time, it will be just completely undeniable, and the other 1/3 of the time, you're still probably going to have better numbers than your opponent's deny roll. And those are pretty solid odds. So I think that if you are planning to use Ulthway, which is pretty powerful, it makes a lot of sense to consider building a list that at least has the option of leaning into a Warpcraft power as a third secondary. So then the question is, does Scry Futures make it as that power? And my answer is, I don't know, but I think maybe it depends on what your opponent's list looks like. I think maybe, and it depends on what your opponent's list looks like. So if your opponent has a number of characters in the list, and those characters are, at least some of them are very forward, and they're not the kinds of things that you absolutely need to kill to destroy synergies in your opponent's list in order to be able to take them down, then don't take Scry Futures, take Psychic Interrogation. It will just be much easier to pull off. On the other hand, if your opponent has very few characters and are characters that really need to die / are going to stay in your opponent's backfield, and you've got some Warlocks and a Farseer on bikes, then you probably can get to at least 9 with this if you score the objectives on your half of the board. And then in a game that's going well for you, at least the way I typically play Craftworlds, I do the vast majority of my scoring in the last 3 turns. I'm very careful on turn 1 and 2. My opponent starts to pull ahead, and then I totally reverse things with... because early in the game as Craftworlds players, especially now, you probably don't want to be giving up a whole lot of units, and so you kind of wear your opponents down. You set up your big play, and then you make the move. And if that's your play style, you might reasonably be able to hope to also score something on your opponent's side of the field late game, and maybe get to 12 with this, maybe get all the way to 15. But you're going to have to read your opponent's list, I think, to decide whether or not you want your psychic choice to be Scry Futures or Psychic Interrogation. I do think there are rare circumstances in which it makes sense to go for the other two, especially if you're running Eldred and you can get him to the center of the board, and it's that mission that requires you to dominate the objective in the center of the board, and your whole battle plan is about the center of the board, then obviously it makes sense to choose that secondary instead. But I think for the most part, you're going to want these two. And against certain kinds of lists, Scry Futures will have some play, particularly for Ulthway. I think that any other Craftworlds list, because of Strands of Fate, it's plausible, but certainly not where I would go first necessarily. Okay, Shadow Operations. Scout the enemy. So here's how this one works. 1 unit from your army can start to perform this action at the end of your movement phase if it is not within 6 inches of your deployment zone. If the unit performing that action is a ranger's unit, it's completed at the end of your turn, otherwise at the start of your next turn. If you perform this action in somewhere in the midfield, you get 2 victory points. If it's actually in your opponent's deployment zone, you get 4. This one's interesting. I think that Rangers are probably going to figure in pretty much every competitive Craftworld list. It's our cheapest troop unit, and they definitely fill an important role. And I think that the interesting thing about this one is that in a turn in which your Rangers are not, running into your opponent's deployment zone and scoring you 4 points, you can still have something that's just sort of out of the way, kind of somewhere in the midfield, reliably getting you 2 points no matter what, and it doesn't suffer from requiring you to have at least 5 or 6 models in the unit, as Retrieve Knockman Data does, in order to be reliable, or something like Engage on All Fronts now, where you need at least 3 models. There's no limiting factor like that. That said, I think that my big concern with this one is that it's going to be hard to get over 10 reliably. It's going to be very hard to do this in your opponent's backfield, because even though Rangers forward deploy, they can't deploy any closer to your opponent's deployment zone than 9 inches. So even if you, on your first turn, were to be able to move them into your opponent's backfield with an advance move or quicken or something, they couldn't then do the action that turn. And the notion that your opponent would leave them alive seems pretty unlikely. I think if you choose this as a secondary, any savvy opponent is going to delete those forward rangers. It's not like hard to get rid of forward rangers. And any other unit that performs this needs to survive until your opponent's next phase. Now, I can imagine versions of this that could be really powerful. So, for example, if you are planning to drop a unit of Wraith Guard with cannons out of Deep Strike into your opponent's backfield on turn 3, you could theoretically use the Will of Azurian psychic power to enable them to perform the Shadow Operations action, shoot something, and they're just so durable that in certain matchups, especially against opponents who are trying to push into the midfield, they just might not be deletable. And if you can have them hang around back there doing this for a few turns, that's 12 points. And if in the first 2 turns of the game you just did it randomly somewhere, on turn 1 you did it with a random unit of rangers in the midfield, and you could pick up another couple of punts there and get to 14 or maybe even all the way to 15. There are definitely ways to make this work. And as a player who really likes behind enemy lines, I am definitely going to mess around with this one. I think it has more potential than a lot of the sort of YouTube reviewers who are out there seem to think that it does. The real question is whether or not it is a better bet than Retrieve Nachmund Data. Now, Retrieve Nachmund Data has been a staple of Craftworld's lists. They're both shadow operations. So you have to choose between them. I think that Retrieve Nachmund Data is it's been nerfed a bit, right? Because now when you do it, you need to roll a d6 if it's not and roll equal to or under the number of infantry or bikes in the unit to succeed on the action, and you get +1 if it's a troops unit. In my last game, I had a unit of 5 Swooping Hawks attempt this at a critical turn, and I rolled a 6. I still won the game, but it was a reminder just how fickle that particular secondary can be. And so I think if you've built for Nachmund Data and you've been doing it successfully and it's working for you, that obviously also has good synergy with Engage on All Fronts. It's such a strong pick for Craftworlds that it's sort of like scary to veer away from it. But if you are thinking about moving away from Engage on All Fronts towards behind enemy lines, then it's possible that Shadow Operations might have really good synergy with that. But again, it's going to be tough to get Rangers into the backfield reliably. You could put some in Deep Strike, and a Latok player might have some additional options here because of their ability to move their Rangers around on the field and bring them in sort of funky ways. I think we're going to have to play with this on the table to really see, but I do think there's potential here for this to be good. But again, there are going to be matchups in which your opponent is going to be able to thwart you, and I think that you're going to have to stay supple on this one. Here it is. It's probably easier to just decide before going into a tournament or something that you are going to commit in all your games to Retrieve Nachmund Data. Whereas this one, I think, for certain lists and certain matchups, really could be significantly better. But it's just there's more decision fatigue at the middle of the match, or at the beginning of the match, because you've got to decide out of the gate whether or not your opponent's list is one of these lists where you can maybe do better with scout the enemy, and that might be enough to just make some people want to shy away from it. But I think that once we do get the hang of it, I do think that this has some play. All right, No Mercy, No Respite, Wrath of Cain. This one is very thematic and very cool. So it's also confusingly worded, but here's how I ultimately read it. If one of your Aspect Warriors destroyed an enemy unit either in melee or in shooting, you score 1 point. And if another one of your Aspect Warriors also destroyed an enemy unit in the other fashion, so you destroyed 1 in shooting and 1 in melee with different Aspect Warrior units, now you're at 4 points. And I'm pretty sure this is how it works. It's confusingly phrased, but essentially it has 3 bullet points. The first 2 say that you get 1 if it's an Aspect Warrior destroys them with melee attacks, and another if an Aspect Warrior destroys them with shooting attacks, and then you get 2 if different aspect warriors did each of those things. I guess there's a circumstance in which you could end up with two if like your shining spears did both maybe, but I think most of the time it's going to be 1 or 4. And this is again, no mercy, no respite. So it takes the place of stuff like grind them down, which is the kill more squads for 3 points. No prisoners, which is points for inflicting wounds on infantry and bikes. And to the last, which is that one that we used to sometimes use with night spinners, among other things, where if your 3 most expensive, for each of your 3 most expensive units alive at the end of the game, you score 5. Now, all 3 of those that I just named have been in the past potentially good third picks for Eldar. So a lot of us were leaning in the old days now into retrieve Octarius data and engage on all fronts, and then trying to choose a target elimination as our third one. I'm not crazy about this one. I want to like it because it's kind of a neat story, but I don't want to be in a position where I have to think about making sure that I don't kill my opponent's units with certain models, like with an artillery piece or I don't know, some deep striking guardians or something. I don't think I'm going to be deep striking a ton of guardians, but maybe, or my wraith guard. Where I'm constantly like, well, no, I have to make sure I leave at least one model alive so that I can mop it up with my banshee squad, and then I want my badass aspect warriors to be able to target the thing that is going to help me win the game. And so what's usually good about the target elimination secondaries is they let you just like play the game. It's like a secondary you don't need to worry about. Yeah, I am going to kill my opponent's army. That is a thing I am going to do. The whole advantage to that is then you aren't devoting additional resources to secondaries. You're scoring those secondary points sort of incidentally. And what this does is it creates this weird, I think somewhat obtuse obstacle to being able to use your aspect warriors optimally, and frankly your other models too. And I'm not super comfortable with that. I also think that a savvy opponent could probably work out like, as long as I can eliminate his melee aspects or put them in situations where they can't kill things, I can cripple his scoring potential. And so I will just make that a priority, and then it's thwartable. So I don't love this one. I think that it could be really fun in narrative play. I don't plan to lean into it a ton. There probably are some tricky ways to make it work in very specific matchups, especially if your opponent has a ton of MSU stuff and you have a ton of aspect warriors. But for the most part, I think it's not a super strong pick. This last one, Hidden Path, is a Battlefield Supremacy pick, and it's super interesting. It's 2 different versions of the objective, one that you play if you have a webway gate in your list, and one that you play if you don't. So the webway gate version works like this. If you choose this secondary, you cannot set the webway gate up within 6 inches of your deployment zone. So that's number 1. And then you score 3 victory points. You score victory points equal to the current battle round if within 3 inches of the webway gate is at least one of your units, and your opponent has no units within 3 inches of the webway gate. So I actually think that this first version of this, while conceptually interesting, and it probably sounded when they were designing it like it was going to be awesome, is a complete and unmitigated disaster, simply because, for the reasons that I already mentioned in my first thoughts video, I'm not convinced you're going to be able to place your webway gate anywhere on the battlefield not within 6 inches of your deployment zone, because terrain like webway gates can't be set up within 3 inches of existing terrain. In ITC tournaments, players take turns placing terrain. Really easy to screen the webway gate, certainly out of objectives. Probably completely out of anywhere that's not like within 6 inches of your deployment zone, or your enemy's deployment zone. There's just going to be nowhere to put it. So if I'm right, and in GW tournaments, there's official tournaments, there's so much terrain on the field that, again, I don't know that you can put it anywhere. And there's this rule that allows players to put a fortification, faction-specific terrain in their own deployment zone by swapping out a piece of existing terrain. But if the way this reads, if you choose this secondary objective, you then literally you give that up, because it specifically says That unit cannot be set up within 6 inches of your deployment zone. If you choose the secondary objective, that includes in your deployment zone. You may just not be able to put it on the field. Now, it's completely possible that I am missing something here. This codex is new. We haven't had a lot of time to play with it. Maybe I'm reading this wrong, but that one looks not viable to me. The second one is curious. So if you don't have a webway gate, you can still choose this secondary objective, and it works like this. You choose an objective marker on the field that is not within 6 inches of your deployment zone, and it's just like the webway gate thing. If you control that objective, essentially, and there are no enemy models, you score victory points equal to the current battle round. Now, that could be really powerful, especially for Craftworld Eldar, who do, at least in my games, I tend to do the vast majority of my primary scoring late game. And that means, on turn 5 and 4 alone, you would be scoring 9 points for controlling that. If you hold it any other turn before the last 2 turns, you are getting above that sort of 10-point mark, which is probably critical for a third secondary. And so in that sense, this is pretty great. Maybe. On the other hand, Craftworld Eldar rely on flexibility and mobility, and having to commit to a particular objective and your opponent knowing that you must commit to that objective is kind of a blow to an army that relies on the ability to just be super mobile and change its mind. I'm losing on this side of the field. Okay, now I'll be on the other side of the field. You tripled down on that objective. Okay, now I'm just going to ignore that one and take all of the other ones late game, right? So I think at least for certain Craftworld's play styles, this might not work great, but on the other hand, there's probably some scoring potential. What's really problematic about this one for me is simply that it's a battlefield supremacy option. So it's competing with behind enemy lines, engage on all fronts, and stranglehold. And I can't really imagine wanting to take this one instead of those. So even though for the right player and the right list and the right matchup, it might have some chops, I don't know if it's ever going to outperform those other ones, at least for me. So that's my take on the secondaries. I think that Scry Futures and Scout the Enemy definitely have possibility in the right list. There are no auto includes here, but those potentially are useful tools. Hidden Path is this, at least the second version of it is interesting, but it's competing with really good stuff. And Wrath of Cain, I think is a narrative move. Psychic powers. There are still Runes of Battle, Runes of Fate, and Runes of Fortune. And the way this usually works is a Psyker has access to either the Runes of Fate or the Runes of Battle, and then anybody can swap Runes of Fortune powers in for those Runes of Fate or Runes of Battle options. So Runes of Fortune no longer replace Smite. I mentioned that in a previous video. That provided some neat tactical flexibility before. That rule's gone, so you've got to make some hard choices. We'll start with Runes of Battle because they're first in the book. It is still true that each Runes of Battle has 2 different effects, one that is a debuff for an enemy unit and one that is a buff for one of your units. And it is also still true that those effects are, for the purposes of double casting a power, which is against the rules, treated as different powers. So, for example, you could cast Jinx in one part of the board and Protect in another part of the board, and they still count as different powers. The same Psyker, if that Psyker has multiple casts, can also do that. Specifically says so in the rules. It also says that if you Conceal Reveal, for example, has a warp charge value of 6. If manifested, select one of the following effects. So you don't have to choose which Runes of Battle power you're activating until you know what you rolled. There are probably not a whole lot of circumstances in which this would matter, but it will matter for Oathway Psykers, right? Because if you, on your first roll, get above a 9 and that power is undeniable, it might be that one of those two, you're planning to do both with your Conclave or something, and one of those powers is more important for you to succeed on. So it's a thing to think about, even though it's probably pretty situational. The first Runes of Battle option, Conceal Reveal, has a warp charge value of 6 and either provides light cover to one of your units within 18 inches, so that's +1 to your armor save, or takes cover bonuses, any cover bonuses that your opponent might have, away from an opponent's unit within 18 inches. Conceal is, and it's only core units, by the way. So, and that's true. All of the, for the most part, all of the psychic powers that used to be able to affect any of our units now only affect core and in some cases character units, and so that's limiting for sure. I will say that Conceal is, if you're playing Eandon, right, where you get to ignore AP -1 and reduce AP -2 to AP -1. If you have some unit with a 3-up save and then you cast Conceal on it, even if it's not in cover, you can make it pretty freaking durable. So I think particularly for Eandon players, Conceal will be super valuable. I don't think that you would put a Psyker into your list specifically to have Reveal. But if you, once you have Conceal Reveal, there are definitely going to be circumstances in which it totally makes sense to use that power. It's a solid tool. It's really good. It hasn't significantly changed from before. Embolden Horrify. This has significantly changed from before. So Warp Charge value 7, if manifested, select one of the following effects. So what Embolden does now is it gives +2 to the leadership characteristic. That's the same. But also, you can give Fight First to one of your units. So in a situation in which, for example, an opponent has a number of units that have charged, and so theoretically they would all get to resolve first. If you have cast Embolden, not only are you braver, but you and your opponent are going to be picking who gets to go when. Fight First powers are always super good. It's great. Horrify subtracts -2 from your opponent's leadership, and it inflicts on an opponent's unit. That unit is not eligible to fight this phase until after every other eligible unit in your army has done so, which is great, and that's until the start of your next psychic phase. So Fight First, Fight Last, really powerful, great tool. And I already mentioned in an earlier video the sort of neat synergy that Embolden/Horrify and Battle Psychers have with Mind War. So Battle Psychers is the ability that would let you cast both of these with the Warlock Conclave. So you could give a Farseer +2 leadership, crank it to 11, give an enemy character -2 leadership, take it down maybe even to a 6, and then do Mind War and potentially do some real damage. Again, that has so many moving parts. There's so many opportunities for you to fail a roll or an opponent to deny something. You need things in position that it's probably not a tool for really competitive play, but certainly in semi-competitive play and in casual play, it's super cool and very thematically Eldar and lots of fun. Enhanced Drain. Warp Charge value 6, you either give +1 to the hit rolls for one of your melee units in melee within 18 inches of the Psyker, or -1 to opponents' hit rolls within 18 inches of the Psyker. I really like this one on Howling Banshees. It's good on Wraithblade. It's good on Striking Scorpions, because if you get more hits, you potentially get more opportunities to trigger the Mandablaster ability, which happens on the wound roll. If you have big, powerful melee units in your army, having Enhance in there is solid. It really does turn up their damage output. As far as the -1 goes, it doesn't help your Banshees, which carry that natively, but it certainly can be useful in circumstances in which specifically something is engaged with. If there's like a fight going on between a couple of powerful characters, right, you can give your character an edge. I will say that because Lightning Fast is down to -1 CP now, I think that Drain is maybe not. There's another way you can get that, and Enhance is probably more valuable. But in melee heavy lists, Enhance is a really valuable tool. Protect Jinx. That used to be the you do not take your Craftworlders to the table without Protect Jinx, because in the 8th Edition Codex, they could affect invuln saves. It was a way to work around opponents' invuln saves and a way to make your 4+ invuln saves a 3+, or in some cases your 3+ invuln saves a 2+. That was super powerful. That's gone. It only affects the save characteristic, not the invuln save. It only affects core units. You can't use it on characters. The blessing, that is. Jinx, you still can. And it also can't take anybody worse than a 6. So your opponent will always have some kind of armor save. Now, this is it's such a big blow that there might be a lot of people who just say, well, now there's be no point in ever taking Protect Jinx. But the power's still good. Again, in an Eandon list, it's another way to get a squad to like a 2+ that's ignoring AP. And then, frankly, that -1, sometimes the ability to throw a -1 on somebody's armor save really can make a big difference, especially with weapons that have high volume of fire, good strength, but they don't have any AP. So if you, for example, were running a unit of 5 scatter bikes, putting out 30 strength 6, 36-inch range scatter laser shots that unfortunately don't have any AP. Well, as soon as you drop an AP on a unit, suddenly that volume of fire is pretty dangerous. The same is true for the Swooping Hawk Las Blaster. Potentially that's really solid. It's going to be tricky, I think, in some cases, just because points have gotten so tight for Craftworlds with the points going up, to fit the number of casters that we might want into a list in order to have access to all the powers that could be good and worth the point value of the caster, because then battlefield slots, that's also a thing. Now, for every Farseer you take, you do get like a free slot for some Warlocks, but you're still spending the points on them. So even when I say, Jinx definitely has play, there are combos there that would be good, don't misunderstand me. It's got to be the right list and the right circumstances, because all of these are competing with one another, and it depends on what else in your list you are synergizing with. Quicken/Restrain. I talked about this in the First Thoughts video. Quicken/Restrain has been massively nerfed. Well, the Quicken half has. It's still the case that when you quicken a unit, it gets to immediately make a normal move, advance, or fall back as if it were your movement phase. But now, if it does so, it is not eligible to shoot, and it is not eligible to declare a charge this turn. And now it's limited only to core and character units. So no more turn 1 Shining Spears, charges, rocketing across the board. There's so many tricks we're using Quicken for that are gone. Quicken could still be super useful in getting units into position on turn 1 to do something on turn 2. It's still going to be helpful for moving Wraith units around, durable objective holders. There's definitely a role for Quicken, but it's not necessarily the role that it was before. Restrain has gotten interesting in a way that it was not interesting before. So, for one thing, it halves the move characteristics of models in the enemy unit. And I actually think that there are a whole bunch of ways to interfere with enemy movement now that nobody's really talking about. I think I mentioned this in an earlier video too. So like scouts have the net that subtracts 2 from enemy movement. And if you know that there's some unit that your opponent is planning to use to charge and eliminate one of your scout units, well, if you cast Restrain on that and then your scouts have the net, and then potentially there are even other things that limit enemy movement, you really might make it just like impossible for them to charge the scouts. And again, I haven't messed around with this, but I think there's probably a way to lean into movement manipulation in a list that could really throw your opponent for a loop, and this could be an interesting and useful tool. So I think despite the nerf, Quicken and Restrain are still good. I just think that the way we think about using it probably will have changed somewhat significantly. Okay, Empower Enervate. This does pretty much the same thing. Within 18 inches of the Psyker, you choose an Azurian core unit. You add 1 to the wound roll. So it's in melee. That's going to be very good pretty much for any unit that that's going to be fighting in melee, but certainly specifically for stuff that doesn't already get the +1 to wound in another way. Like Banshees just get that now on the charge, so maybe you're not looking at your Banshees for this, but it is very good. Enervate, though, I think we have long perhaps underestimated Enervate. Subtracting 1 from your opponent's wound roll is really good it's like stealth good, especially if your opponent is trying to defeat something that's pretty tough. So if your opponent, for example, has a bunch of, like a big mob of melee infantry that's pretty effective with 3 attacks per model, engaged with something like a Wraith Lord or a Wraith Seer or even the Avatar of Cain, and they're in a situation where that big mob is putting out like 30 or 40 attacks, and so even though they would only be wounding on a 5+, they have enough attacks maybe to do it. And if you cast Enervate on them, now they're only wounding on a 6. That's super frustrating. Now they probably will just ping off. You're halving their damage output. And again, I think that if you're planning to run a big forward combat monster like that in your list, Enervate can just help make that thing an absolute nightmare to get rid of. I think probably especially the Avatar of Cain, which already has all sorts of durability and sanity. When we get to talking about data sheets, I will talk a little bit about the Avatar of Cain, and and eventually I'll do unit focus videos, and we'll go way down the rabbit hole on all this stuff. But I think there's play for Enervate that not only exists in this codex, but we may have actually overlooked in the last one. Okay, Runes of Fate guide. Guide still lets a unit re-roll its hit dice in whatever phase. Hit rolls, you re-roll. But now it has to be a core unit. You have to be with 18 inches of the Psyker, unless you roll a 10 or more, and then it goes to 24 inches. And that's, by the way, now the standard thing for Farseers is it's an 18-inch range, but then if you roll really well, it goes to a 24-inch range, and you don't have to choose your target until after you have rolled the dice. A thing that I still, even though this has been a rule for a long time, a thing that I still do it intuitively. I don't know why. When I cast Psychic Powers, I always say, I am casting blah, blah, blah on that. Technically, I don't have to choose the target until after I've rolled the dice, but I do this just as a matter of habit. I should try to stop. Guide is good. Obviously, there are all sorts of units we were using it on before that you can't use it on anymore. You're not going to be using it on Night Spinners now, for example. And Dark Reapers have gotten hit so hard that the big unit of Dark Reapers in your back, for one thing, they can't be in big units anymore. I think it's limited to 5 now. You're probably not going to have some unit of Dark Reapers in your backfield that you want to cast Guide on. But there's still all kinds of good targets for this. A unit of Fire Dragons jumping out of Falcon, great. Guide them. A unit of Wraiths with cannons, good. Shadow Specters, guide them. Any good shooting unit can definitely benefit from this. Everybody has a Farseer in their army. Guide is still very solid, even if we're not going to be using it on vehicles anymore. I think you can probably on your own think of all kinds of great synergies. I won't try to name them all. Doom is still good, but more limited. So Doom does the thing it used to do before. It lets you reroll wound rolls. It's now an 18-inch range instead of a 24-inch range. That obviously hits Doom harder than Guide, because Guide you tend to be using on units that are near your Farseer anyway, whereas Doom, you're like reaching for the target. But if you roll 10 or more, you have that 24-inch range again. Aside from the Doom nerf, it's now only core units and characters that get to reroll wounds. But I think we're all going to be leaning into Aspect Warriors in a bigger way. Bikes are good. I mean, characters, our HQs are good. In the games that I have played so far, I have not found this change to be as big an issue as I thought it would be. What I like for Doom now is enemy units in the midfield that you want to make vulnerable to massed fire from either a big unit of swooping hawks or massed shuriken fire, and you use Doom to have essentially small arms fire take down something that would usually be above their pay grade, like a vehicle or a monster. Because if you're only wounding that thing on 5 up, but you're re-rolling all of the other dice, it's actually slightly statistically better than being able to wound it on a 4 up. And a bunch of Craftworld's weapons, shuriken weapons, the Ranger long rifle, get a bonus on 6s to wound, so the ability to reroll all those misses again also increases the number of 6s. I think the Doom is still really good. It's just we're playing it a little bit differently, and I think the scope of possible targets for it has changed a little bit. But I think it remains a clutch tool despite the nerfs. Fortune does the same thing that it did before. Warp charge value 6. If manifested, you give a 5-up feel no pain save to a unit within 18 inches or 24 if you roll above a 10. But now you're limited to core units and character units. But it's great. The 5-up feel no pain is great. It's really good for your objective holders. Super solid on some Wraith Blades, which can no longer get to a 3-up on their invuln. It's super solid on, honestly, even something like a Phoenix Lord that's playing really aggressively and relying on the resurrection stratagem. I mean, there's just sort of all. I think there are a wide variety of situations in which Fortune will be super useful. Executioner has changed too. It's still is warp charge value 7, and if it succeeds, you select an enemy unit within 18 inches of the Psyker now, and 24 again if you roll well, and you do D3 mortal wounds, and if you destroy any models, you do another D3, but now you can only target units with a wound characteristic of 9 or less. So it's not necessarily an opportunity to like be an extra smite against some big target, but it's still good. Again, don't love the 18-inch range, but you can choose units that are not the closest unit, which is a nice advantage over smite. And if you're doing a combat Farseer on a bike, there certainly might be circumstances in which you want to take Executioner. The reason that I don't plan to lean into it is because of the next power, Will of Azurian. So this is, and again, I mentioned this already in my first thoughts video, so I'm not going to talk about it a ton, but it's so good. I think that this is the don't leave home without it power this time around. It's warp charge value 6, 18 inches, core or character. It gains objective secured, cannot fail morale tests, and can perform an action and still shoot. And if you roll 8 or better on the psychic test, it's a 24-inch range. So it's even easier to pull this off at really long range. This is so freaking good, right? You can have an MSU unit of Wind Riders with objective secured, just jump onto an objective and strip an opponent of it. You can give 10 Swooping Hawks that put out 40 shots the ability to jump onto an objective, have OBSEC. They have a 5-up invul now, and there's a relic that gives them a 5-up feel no pain. And you can have them shoot something and still perform an action while they're standing. I mean, there's so much you can do with this, and it helps so much with objective control, which is the place where Craftworld Eldar, from the perspective of scoring, I think still struggle most. We're a fragile elite army, and so the OBSEC game can be tricky. And Will of Azurian is just this incredible tool for helping us mitigate that. So good. I don't plan to leave home without this one. Mind Warp I've already talked about twice in this Codex review. So I will just very quickly tell you that it's warp charge value 7. If you succeed, you choose an enemy character within 18 inches of the Psyker, and you each roll a d6 and add your leadership value. And if you roll higher than your opponent, or if the end number is higher than your opponent's end number, for every one that it is higher, your opponent takes a mortal wound. If the result of your psychic test was a 10 or better, instead of rolling a d6, you roll 2d3. That's obviously a bit better. In combination with stuff that boosts your leadership and lowers your opponent's leadership, like that Embolden Horrify combo, and Farseers already have naturally high leadership, you could potentially create a big gulf and do some serious damage. So there's that. And I've already talked about the reasons why I think it's great in everything but really high level competitive play, at which point it's too risky. Runes of Fortune. These are good. These are situational. These might have a difficult time in many cases unseating other options, but nevertheless, when you build for them, they can have amazing synergy with stuff in your army. So Fateful Divergence. Warp charge value 6. If manifested, you get a command point. In a list that's super CP hungry, where you need a lot of extra CP, maybe. I'm not sold on this one. There's too many powers that do cool things. Witch Strike. this has changed significantly. Warp charge value 5. Now, instead of raising the damage characteristic of your weapon by 2, if you successfully wound the target, you just automatically do 1 mortal wound and the attack sequence ends. And I think this is really not good because, yes, you can get some mortal wounds past an invuln, but really giving up the opportunity for them to... So, for example, on something like a Wraithseer, which used to be a great pick for this, the Wraithseer weapon, which does D3 plus 3 damage, you don't want to do flat 1 instead of that. And it works only on the caster, not on the whole squad. So like on a Warlock Conclave, you've got, even if there are a bunch of models in the unit, you have 1 model doing two attacks. I just can't really imagine a way in which this is going to be good. I don't see this being a thing you'd ever want to take. 3, Ghostwalk. This is fabulous. Warp charge value 5. If manifested, select an Azurian core or character unit within 12 inches of the Psyker and add 2 to charge rolls. It's the same thing as before, but before I think you had to be within 6 inches, and now it's within 12, which is really good. And that is a fabulous tool. It means that in combination with the Strands of Fate dice, you can make units coming in and out of Deep Strike within 12 inches of the Psyker, if you have a Strands of Fate die for a charge, incapable of failing a charge, because it's 6 for the Strands of Fate die, plus 2 for Ghostwalk, and the worst you could roll is a 1, so you could get to 9 for sure, even if you have the worst possible charge roll. So Ghostwalk, for those of you who are planning to use some serious melee aggression, Ghostwalk is just fantastic. It's a great option. Crushing Orb. Crushing Orb has a warp charge value of 6. If manifested, select 1 enemy unit within 18 inches invisible to the Psyker. Roll 3d6, adding 2 to each result if that enemy unit is a vehicle or a monster, or it contains 6 or more models. For each 4+, that enemy unit suffers 1 mortal wound. So obviously you really only want to be targeting monsters and big units. It's a way to, because then you're doing it on a 2+. It's a way to put some mortal wounds on monsters and stuff. This is good. It's solid. If it could still take the place of Smite, I might want it. But there's so much other really good stuff that has synergies that will make other things that your army can do generate, I think, significantly more damage than will the Crushing Orb. Unless you're doing some kind of mortal wound Psyker spam, in which case, you know, if you're doing Executioner and Smite a bunch of times and Crushing Orb, and you just need it in there for yet more mortal wound Psyker spam, then there probably is a way to do this that makes sense. But I think barring that boutique list, it's not a thing you want to do. But that tends to be true of the Runes of Fortune Powers anyways, that they are a little bit boutique. Even Ghostwalk, right? Unless you're running a bunch of melee units that are going to need to come in that way, it's probably not a thing you need to allocate a power to. Focus Will. It makes another power more reliable. Warp charge value 6. Select 1 friendly Psyker within 24 inches until the start of your next Psychic phase. Add 2 to Psychic tests and deny the Witch tests. I'm pretty sure that range is significantly greater than it used to be, which is cool. Focus Will is great. And notice that it says Psychic tests. So, I mean, the obvious move here is to give Focus Will to a Psyker who has a single cast and to cast it on a Psyker who has multiple casts. Really good on somebody like Eldred or somebody with a relic that gives them an extra cast, so that you're getting +2 a bunch of times. Also getting the +2 to the deny the witch tests too. Just absolutely clutch. So good. I think that if you were relying on somebody like Eldred as an Ulthway player, there's a 100% chance that you want this in your list. Last one, Impair Senses, excuse me. Warp charge value 6. Select 1 enemy unit within 18 inches and visible to the Psyker. Until you're at the start of your next Psychic phase, that enemy unit cannot be affected by aura abilities from units in your opponent's army. This could be so good. There are so many really scary, really powerful aura abilities, and whether or not this makes sense for you to take, I think depends on your local meta. Are you coming up against that stuff? / what if you're going to a big tournament, what is the current tournament meta? And if there are powerful aura abilities that are rocking things, then I think it absolutely makes sense to slip Impair Senses into your list. And at times and in metas where it isn't, it's probably not a good take. And I will admit, I feel a little bit shy about stuff that is quite so meta dependent. But in metas where powerful auras are a thing, I think that potentially could be a real game changer in particular matchups. And so this is going to require you, whether or not you take this, is going to require you really knowing what makes sense in your own meta, or what the tournament scene is like that you're planning to attend. But do not forget about that as a tool that is potentially super powerful. Oh, lastly, I am 99% sure that when I talked about Restrain, I forgot to mention that Restrain now prevents units from performing actions. I know that I mentioned it in the First Thoughts video. And if I did mention it, and I'm saying it again, I'm sorry. I'm a bit sleep deprived. We have a 2-year-old and a 3-month-old, and sleep has been challenging recently. So the ability to guarantee that your opponent will fail any action they attempt to perform until your next turn. Again, I said this in the First Thoughts, but in a game that is currently largely dependent for secondary scoring and some primary scoring on an action economy, that is potentially a hugely useful tool. And it's yet another reason why you might want to take Quicken Restrain despite the nerf to Quicken. I will say that if you're going to take Quicken Restrain, I do think you need to have something in your army that you might theoretically want to quicken. I think taking a Psyker that only knows Quicken Restrain exclusively to use Restrain could potentially end up as an underused tool. But if you also have some Wraiths or something that you need to move on to an objective, then I think potentially it's very, very good. Now, obviously, there are or synergies and ways of using those psychic powers that I've covered here. I was just trying to give a sort of overall review of each one's competitive viability and then suggest one or two pretty good ways of using it. But once we've been playing for a while and we're teasing out which units seem to be seeing the most play, have the most potential, once I start doing unit focused videos, once we start getting tournament results, I will definitely revisit all of these, if not in a video specifically about psychic powers, certainly when we talk about specific tactics and units in later videos. That's the overview. When I come back next time, we will start talking about data sheets. In the first video, I will do at least all of the HQs and troops. I might also start in on elites. I plan to break the data sheet review into 2 parts, and then that will wrap up the initial pass on the Codex, and we will start in on unit focus videos after I talk about the content in the latest White Dwarf, which is also interesting and fun and Craftworld's relevant. If you liked this video, I hope that you will click like. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I hope that you will consider subscribing to the channel. If you have your own thoughts about the psychic powers or secondaries, I hope that you will leave those below. And if you just want to help out my algorithm by saying hello or telling me a fun fact about your army or one of your pets, that's cool too. Thanks, guys. I will look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.